Alright, so we all know what mana is. In video games, it's the blue stuff that powers magic. A sort of mystical fuel or ammunition. The wizard can cast spells till he runs out of mana, then he'll probably drink a mana potion to refill his mana points so he can cast some more. Lots of games make up their own words for it, but it's a pretty standard term at this point. When I was a kid, the only other place I heard the term mana being used was in the phrase manna from heaven, coming from the Bible. It always kind of bugged me. How did this random Bible word become the de facto term for arcane magical power? And why was it always blue? For those unfamiliar with the biblical term, in the book of Exodus, Moses is leading his people out of Egypt. They're hungry, desperate, and then, in a moment of divine intervention, God provides them with a sort of magical bread. This bread from heaven was given the name manna. Now, I can always kind of see the connection here. Manna as a divine gift of food versus mana, a sort of magical energy. But it never really made a ton of sense to me. The bread itself isn't really magic, and it didn't give the people that ate it any sort of magical energy or power. So how did mana go from a divine bread to a magical spellcasting energy? Well, turns out it didn't. I was surprised to learn that mana, the bread, is spelled with two N's, and not the M-A-N-A we usually see today in games. It's basically a big coincidence. Two words in two different languages that sound the same. We need to jump across the world to the islands of Polynesia. In Polynesian culture, mana has a different meaning. It can refer to powerful forces of nature, such as storms. It can sometimes be supernatural powers. In some cultures, it's more of a personal power, a sort of strength of character that gives people influence and authority. It sometimes just means the right or the ability to do something. Unlike the mana from Exodus, this mana is more closely tied to the idea of an intangible or spiritual force, qualities that later become essential to the word's use in fantasy. But it's still pretty different to the modern idea of a magical fuel source. And how did it end up making the jump to video games? To get to that, we need to go back to the 1950s and 60s. As the beatnik and hippie countercultures became popular, there was an increased interest in religions and philosophies from around the world. Ideas like Zen meditation, yoga, and mana gained popularity in Western society. But these people often took a more simplified, direct interpretation of mana, treating it more like a unifying spiritual energy. The way they talk about it, it sounds kind of like the Force in Star Wars. In 1954, J.R.R. Tolkien published the first book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Up until this point, fantasy stories were considered primarily a genre for children. But Lord of the Rings made people look at it in a whole new light. It led to a huge boom in the genre of fantasy literature. A lot of what are now standard fantasy tropes come from Tolkien's work. Now, it's important to note that Tolkien never uses the word mana. In his books, magic tends to be less defined. Magical beings just do magical things, and there's definitely not a scene where Gandalf has to drink a blue potion to use more magic. The earliest example I could find of the word mana in a fantasy story is the 1961 short story The Moon Moth, written by Jack Vance. Remember that name because he's going to come up again later. In this story, a man must navigate a complicated alien society that puts a great importance on prestige and societal hierarchy. Vance uses the word only once and keeps to a traditional meaning. He compares it to prestige, face, repute, and glory. It wasn't until 1969 that mana was explicitly linked to magic in a fantasy story. Larry Nevin's short story, Not Long Before the End, describes a battle between a warlock and a man wielding a cursed magical sword. He explicitly describes mana as a power that fuels magical abilities, saying, "Mana is the name we give to the power behind magic." In this story, it's treated as a dwindling resource that is slowly being used up. Now let's talk about games. Just as a lot of fantasy writing is built off Tolkien's work, fantasy video games have been heavily influenced by tabletop RPGs. The most influential of these, of course, being Dungeons & Dragons. Released in 1974, it's pretty easy to see how Lord of the Rings provided something of a blueprint for D&D classes and races. Now, D&D doesn't use mana either. Instead, it employed a spell system based off the work of writer Jack Vance, who we mentioned earlier. With the Vancian casting system, a wizard could memorize a limited number of spells, which they would forget immediately after casting. So instead of a spell having a mana cost, the player could cast a spell a certain number of times, or they might have the ability to cast, 3 level 2 spells before resting. The success of D&D led to 2 important things. The first was a surge of similar pen and paper RPGs. The second was a wave of video games that tried to adapt either the rules or the general experience of D&D. The Ardwin Grimoire, a lesser-known tabletop RPG published in 1977, was mechanically pretty similar to Dungeons & Dragons. Like D&D, it used Vancian casting. Wizards memorized their spells, forgot them once they were cast, but it added a twist. Wizards had a pool of mana, and spells had a mana cost. This is the earliest example I could find of a game using the word mana. Here they compare it to an internal power. It actually ended up taking a while for video games to catch on to mana. Early video RPGs tended to stick with D&D's leveled spell system. Even the first Final Fantasy game did this. 1979's Alclavath had magical amulets with limited charges. Games like Final Fantasy II and Dragon Warrior / Quest introduced magic points or spell points, often abbreviated as MP or SP, effectively a mana system, just without actually using the word mana. Dungeon Master in 1987 is credited with being the first video game to explicitly use the term mana. This game also helped standardize many RPG elements that we see today, including things like the paper doll inventory system. '93 was a very big year for mana. It saw the release of both Secret of Mana and Magic the Gathering. Secret of Mana is probably the first time that I personally ever heard the word mana, and they really used it. You have to find a mana sword so you can discover mana seeds to hopefully stop someone from using a mana fortress.
That must be the mana tree! I've that mana sword.
The mana tree can... The mana tree! Mana fortress!
The constant use of the term, including the title, seems to have pretty firmly established the word in the gaming lexicon. Magic the Gathering also heavily featured mana. Players gained different colored mana from the land itself, then used this to power magic spells and summon mystical beasts. If this sounds similar to Larry Nevern's work, there's actually a magic card based on his name. So again, a very popular game reinforcing the idea of mana as an energy source used to fuel magical abilities. So to summarize, mana from heaven in the Christian Bible, completely unrelated. The true origin is Polynesia. Various counterculture movements in the 50s and 60s fueled interest in New Age religions and Eastern philosophy, bringing the word mana to the West, but it also led to a more direct, simplified understanding of its meaning. Lord of the Rings and then later D&D popularized fantasy writing and fantasy gaming, as well as standardizing various fantasy tropes. The word starts popping up in books and games throughout the 70s and 80s, and by the 90s was well established. So why is it always blue? Dungeon Master, the first game to use the word mana, did actually have blue mana potions. But if you take a look at this list, pretty much all the potions were also blue, so that probably doesn't mean a whole lot. I've seen a few explanations for this. My favorite is that it is somehow related to the 1965 novel Dune. In this series, spice is a drug that prolongs life and can unlock special mental abilities, and it has the side effect of turning the user's eyes blue. It's an interesting theory, but I couldn't really find anything to back it up. The real answer is probably pretty simple, just basic design and color theory. You've got a red health bar and you have your guys drinking red potions. So you pick a contrasting color to set it apart and keep it visually distinct. Maybe they just thought that blue felt a little more mystical than green. Who's to say? A lot of credit seems to go to Blizzard, Warcraft 2 in 1995, and especially Diablo in 1997. Both of these were extremely popular games, and they used blue to represent mana. Diablo in particular cemented the blue vial of mana as a standard visual shorthand. If anyone's ever played that, you probably still remember that little row of red and blue potions and those great big globes of health and mana in the corners of the screen. And there you have it, the history of the word mana, how it found its way into pop culture and then eventually gaming, why it's usually blue. And if you have your own dumb question that you want answered, or you think there's something I missed, let me know. And thank you for watching.